Some places are designed to be forgotten, not in the sense of memory, but in the deeper way of being deliberately overlooked, sent away from the eyes and minds of those in power until you become less a person and more a maintenance cost. Cathara Station existed in exactly this category of oblivion, orbiting a nameless gas giant at the absolute perimeter of human territorial control. This sprawling industrial complex had stopped being relevant somewhere around the time the colonial expansion reached its peak. What remained now was skeletal systems, recycled air that tasted like metal and regret, and one man who'd learned to appreciate the company of machinery over that of his species. Commander Marcus Cole, though the rank felt more honorary than actual these days, spent his mornings in the same way he spent his evenings, elbow deep in mechanical failures. Today it was the ventilation system again, a corroded network of ducts that wheezed and groaned with the effort of sustaining breathable atmosphere. The work was mindless enough to be meditative, mindless enough to not require him to think about the 43 days that had passed without a single transmission from Central Command. 43 days of silence was, in his assessment, basically a gift. Transmissions meant attention. Attention meant bureaucratic machinery grinding to life, and every time those gears started spinning, something unpleasant eventually landed on his isolated outpost. He'd learned this through years of service, each posting progressively more remote, each assignment conveying in its own way the message that the military apparatus had reached a verdict on his usefulness. Adequate enough to maintain, inconvenient enough to hide. The console panel chimed. Marcus went still, his grease-stained hands freezing mid-motion within the mechanical guts of the recycler. Not amber, the blue pulse of the diplomatic frequency, the specific blue that made his jaw tighten involuntarily. He extracted himself from the machinery with deliberate slowness, wiping his hands on fatigues that had outlasted their practical lifespan by several years. The uniform hung on his frame like something designed for a man he used to be. If heavier, probably happier, definitely less aware of what he was capable of doing when necessity demanded it. At 34, Marcus carried the aesthetic of someone whose life had been primarily spent solving problems rather than creating them. His hands were scarred from years of labor. His eyes had developed the particular focusing capacity of a man who'd learned to read a situation before it fully formed, and his face, weathered from years of orbital station life, where the sun never touched it but stress aged it anyway, bore the neutral expression of someone preparing for information. He didn't want. He activated the console. The message was brief, economical, written in the compressed protocol of Solarian diplomatic exchange. Reading it once was apparently insufficient for comprehension. He read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the meaning. The Solarian Dominion, in accordance with bilateral agreement clauses, was dispatching a royal diplomatic consort to Cathara Station as a continuation of their interspecies goodwill initiative. He looked around the station. The lights above continued their rhythmic dimming and brightening, a system malfunction he kept meaning to fix. Scattered across the maintenance bay floor were components of machines that kept this place functioning through sheer spite. On his workbench sat a coffee container he'd been using without washing for approximately 6 weeks. He wasn't proud of this fact, simply aware of it. "I'm the human delegation," he said, into the empty maintenance bay, and the words carried a weight of irony that even the station's automatic systems seemed to recognize through their indifference. 14 hours later, he'd accomplished a transformation that he'd classify as adequate, but not impressive. The main corridor no longer looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic survival narrative. The guest quarters now featured clean sheets instead of whatever culture had been developing in there before. He'd located a shirt that didn't have any visible stains and put it on, accepting this small victory as something approaching prepared. The transport vessel appeared in the viewport like a deliberate counterpoint to everything about this station. Sleek, expensive, covered in diplomatic insignia rendered in materials that caught light in ways Cathara's industrial framework never would. The contrast was almost insulting. Why deploy something this refined to a location this forgotten? That question sat uneasily in his mind as the airlock cycled. The guards emerged first. 4 of them, Solarian military personnel in ceremonial armor, that looked more impressive than practical. They moved with the specific arrogance of individuals who'd never met a situation their species authority didn't automatically resolve. Then she entered the docking bay, and whatever mental preparation Marcus had managed dissolved entirely. He'd encountered Solarian females in diplomatic contexts before. Imagery, briefings, that one trade summit on Arcturus where he'd been assigned security detail. The species possessed an aesthetic quality that made human artistic traditions seem suddenly inadequate, like they were trying to paint symphonies with primary colors. But this woman wasn't just striking. She existed in a category where visual assessment failed as a tool. Her skin was blue-violet, deeper than the ceremonial guards, with a luminescence that suggested the light source came from within rather than reflecting off her surface. Her hair, silver white, fell straight to her shoulders in a way that suggested genetics rather than styling. Her face was constructed from angles and proportion that seemed designed to make observation difficult. High architecture of cheekbones, a mouth positioned at rest in a line that spoke of practice control, eyes the color of aged amber that moved through the bay with methodical assessment. She wore simple clothing, charcoal-colored, fitted but without ornamentation. No rank insignia, no jewelry, no markers of status, which Marcus understood through the lens of Solarian culture, actually conveyed the opposite impression, that she was important enough not to need external validation of her position. What struck him most profoundly was her posture, straight-backed, chin level, shoulders squared, not the bearing of someone arriving at a new assignment, not even the demeanor of diplomatic business as usual. This was the physical language of someone walking towards something terminal and refusing to permit themselves the luxury of flinching. The lead guard stepped forward, tall, thin-lipped, carrying the permanent expression of someone who just tasted something foul and couldn't quite remove it from their sensory memory. He produced a data tablet and began reading in tones that mixed ceremony with contempt, so seamlessly they seemed designed to work together. By order of the Grand Council of the Solarian Dominion, the guard continued, his words carefully modulated. Her diminished grace Valeth Sorenkai is remanded to the care of the human delegation at Catharas Station in fulfillment of Article 9, subsection 7 of the Bilateral Goodwill Accords. The modifier caught Marcus's attention. Diminished, in Solarian culture. That wasn't a description. It was a demotion, a public statement of lowered status, a word that carried the weight of institutional judgment. The guard switched briefly to his native language, speaking to his guards with obvious amusement. Marcus's grasp of Solarian was fragmented, assembled through intelligence briefings and countless nights studying when insomnia made sleep impossible. He caught enough. Let the human keep their joke. The words landed in the bay like something with mass. Valeth's jaw tightened, a muscle flexed in her neck, but she maintained complete visual stillness, her gaze fixed at a point beyond Marcus's shoulder, her amber eyes burning with something that appeared to require significant effort to contain. The guards didn't extend their visit. They deposited a single case, small enough to suggest its owner hadn't been expected to need much, and exchanged smirks they made certain Marcus witnessed before returning to their vessel. The transport detached with hydraulic efficiency, shrinking into the vacuum until it became another point of light indistinguishable from the stars. Marcus and Valeth occupied the same physical space, separated by approximately 10 meters of docking bay and an entire universe of unspoken tension. She stared at the deck plates. Her hands, clasped in front of her, had their knuckles positioned so tightly they appeared ready to break through skin. The bioluminescent patterns Marcus now noticed running along her forearms, constellation-like arrangements of light beneath her skin, had dimmed to near invisibility. So, Marcus said, because silence was apparently something his brain refused to permit. You interested in the station overview? Fair warning, it's brief. Essentially amounts to this bay, the corridor over there, and the room where I spend my time wondering if this entire existence has been an elaborate administrative error. She blinked. Her eyes lifted to his face, searching for something. Mockery, probably, or confirmation of her worst assumptions. She didn't seem to find either. I require nothing, she said, and her voice was lower than he'd expected, musical in the way Solarian speech carried inherent tonal resonance, but tightly controlled. My requirements are minimal. Well, Marcus picked up her case, noting how light it was, impossibly light for someone leaving their entire constructed life behind. Minimal requirements or not, you've still got space allocated for occupancy. Might as well use it. He walked her through the station, using terminology that was technically accurate, but conveyed the deeper reality of a place that had accepted its obsolescence. Guest quarters turned out to be clean sheets on a functional bed, a viewport that displayed the gas giant's amber and rust-colored atmospheric bands. A door that closed for privacy. He made note of the practical systems, recycler function, lighting controls, the corridor location of food preparation facilities. He explained the schedule he maintained for meals, the handful of operational systems that required attention, the specific panel in the engine room that would electrocute you if you touched it without proper precautions. She stood in the doorway like she was made of material too fragile for casual movement, her entire frame engaged in the project of not falling apart. You will not ask me anything, she said. It wasn't a question. Like what? Marcus actually looked surprised by his own lack of curiosity. Why? I was dispatched. What my diagnosis entails. What the political implications of my presence suggest. Whether I'm here to fulfill some obscure diplomatic function or simply to be removed from the Dominion's public consciousness. Marcus leaned against the corridor wall, genuinely considering the question. I know why you were sent two birds with one policy. They wanted to humiliate you and communicate something insulting about humanity simultaneously. Efficient, what you actually are is your own business. Medical history, genetic profile, cultural context. None of that changes anything about the arrangement you've got here. And what's expected is actually nothing. You're a person, not a diplomatic package. Get rest if you need it. Eat when hunger becomes relevant. Don't touch the panel marked C7 in the engine room, unless you want to understand what electricity feels like. He walked away then, returning to his ventilation recycler, and the mechanical problems that still required solving. Behind him, so quiet, he almost missed it, Valith exhaled a single breath that shook at its edges like something tension-wound had loosened by exactly one rotation. She didn't emerge from those quarters for approximately 24 hours. Marcus had learned long ago not to interpret silence as rejection. Sometimes people needed processing time. Sometimes being forcibly uprooted and deposited in an unfamiliar environment required a recovery period before social interaction became feasible. So he went about his routines unchanged, preparing the standard ration-based breakfast, setting a portion outside her door, knocking once with no expectation of response, and returning to his work. When he passed by an hour later, the plate remained positioned where he'd left it, but it had been moved slightly. She'd opened the door, seen it, recognized it as intentional rather than accidental, and closed the door again, leaving the food untouched but accepting its presence. The second morning, he repeated the process. This time, when he returned, the plate had been moved into her quarters entirely. It was positioned outside her door, utensils arranged parallel to each other in a configuration that suggested either military precision or royal precision. With Solarians, it was often difficult to distinguish between disciplines that had become culturally identical. On the afternoon of the second day, while Marcus was engaged beneath the main water filtration unit, cursing at a corroded coupling that had apparently made a permanent decision not to respond to standard maintenance techniques, Valith appeared in the doorway. She watched him work with the expression of someone conducting a scientific observation on a particularly interesting specimen. That coupling is fused, she said, not phrasing it as observation, but as fact-based assessment. Applying force will damage the interior threads. Marcus extracted himself partially from the machinery. You study fluid systems? Corrosion mechanics specifically. This station's plumbing utilizes an alloy that exhibits reactive properties when exposed to atmospheric sulfides. She stepped closer, kneeling beside the machinery with the focus of someone whose mind had already begun solving the problem. You require a chemical solvent of moderate concentration. Do you have citric compounds in your ration inventory? 40 minutes of work later, the coupling came free. Vela's hands were stained with grease and residual chemical compound, but her posture had transformed. The rigid formality had dissolved into pure focus. She was in her element, thinking through problems, using her intellect as the tool it actually was. You were trained in research? Marcus observed. Not as a question, xenobiological compatibility research, she replied, then seemed to catch herself oversharing. Her jaw tightened slightly, like she'd revealed classified information. Marcus simply handed her a clean rag. Dinner happens in approximately 2 hours. I'm preparing something I describe generously as stew. It's objectively terrible, but it will be hot. The ghost of something approximating a smile crossed her features. You are unorthodox, Marcus Cole. So I've been informed repeatedly. What emerged over the following days was rhythm, not the structured rhythm of military protocols or diplomatic procedures, but the organic rhythm of two people occupying the same space and gradually learning each other's conversational wavelengths. Mornings featured Marcus's attempts at food preparation. Valith appeared with increasing regularity, initially eating in silence, then offering fragments of conversation that grew longer with each passing day. He learned that she preferred her water temperature elevated, she slept minimally, and when she believed observation wasn't occurring, she stood at viewports with her palm pressed against the transparent aluminum, her expression containing equal quantities of longing and rage directed at the starfield beyond. He didn't push. Solitude had taught him that some internal walls required dismantling from within, rather than being broken down from outside. The station was small, though. 2 humans occupying space, designed for 6 creates the kind of proximity that prevents meaningful avoidance. They moved through the same corridors, shared galley facilities, and worked alongside each other when mechanical and biological systems demanded simultaneous attention. One evening, Valith initiated something beyond practical discussion. Tell me about your planetary origin, she said. Positioned across from Marcus at the small mess table, she'd begun wearing one of his spare shirts over her native garment. It was substantially oversized on her frame, and this fact seemed to affect something in Marcus's neural pathways that he preferred not to examine too closely. Earth? He reclined, considering how to translate decades of experience into accessible language. It's green in most places. incredibly loud in the population-dense regions, simultaneously overcrowded in urban centers and beautifully devastatingly empty in other locations. What specific element do you experience as missing? Rain? The answer surfaced without cognitive processing, not just the precipitation event itself, but everything surrounding it. The acoustic profile, when it contacts structure and you're protected inside, the olfactory signature that precedes the event, the way the entire environmental aesthetic appears renewed afterward. She frowned slightly. Atmospheric precipitation? Exactly. But that's just the technical categorization. The actual phenomenon is more complex. He paused. Sounds stupid, probably, wanting something so basic. It is not stupid, Wallace said quietly. My planetary origin maintains controlled climate protocols. Precipitation is managed systematically. I have consumed literature describing natural rainfall phenomena, but literature does not constitute genuine experience. Marcus looked at her for a duration that exceeded normal social intervals. When we eventually escape this location, I'm taking you somewhere rain actually occurs. She held his gaze. The bioluminescent patterns along her wrists brightened momentarily before diminishing again. I would appreciate that experience, she replied. The first time he witnessed her genuine anger, not controlled fury, but the raw thing itself, happened in the observation bay. Marcus had searched for her after she'd skipped the evening meal, which she never did. He found her positioned on the floor beneath the viewport, knees drawn upward, fists clenched, staring at the gas giant's swirling atmospheric patterns below. She wasn't crying. Marcus had learned by this point that Valeth didn't cry. She burned instead. Hey, he said, settling onto the floor beside her. Not close enough to crowd her space, but close enough to establish presence. They erased me. Her voice was absolutely level, which made it more terrifying than any emotional outburst could have achieved. 7 years of research into xenogenetic compatibility protocols. When the medical diagnosis was confirmed, they confiscated every piece of work, reassigned my research facility, credited my findings to a colleague who contributed absolutely nothing of value. Marcus said nothing. He waited, because waiting was sometimes the appropriate response. My genetic mother, Valeth continued, and something fractured in the word structure, was a rival to the political matriarch. When my medical status became public, she stood before the council and formally disowned me. Not because she believed the rejection, but because it was politically convenient to eliminate me before the Grand Matriarch could weaponize me against her. The Grand Matriarch? Celine? My father's sister. She orchestrated the entirety of this sequence. Valeth's eyes turned to him, blazing with fury that seemed physically present. She wanted me to disappear quietly, to become nothing in a location that represents nothing itself, supervised by a species she fundamentally does not respect. The fury in her voice could have stripped hull plating. Marcus let it exist without minimization. He didn't attempt comfort. He didn't try to contextualize the experience or offer perspective that might make it seem more survivable. He simply remained present while she inhabited the full landscape of her anger. When the silence had cooled sufficiently to permit respiration, he spoke. You understand what I actually think? I think a civilization that discards its most valuable people based on a medical result isn't sophisticated. It's afraid. They didn't erase you because you were broken, Valeth. They erased you because, even without reproductive capacity, you represented more capability and intelligence than the people managing their systems. That possibility terrified them. She stared at him. The patterns along her neck and collarbone flickered once, twice, then stabilized at a luminescence level he hadn't seen before. You genuinely hold that assessment? She said, I maintain it because I'm positioned in front of a woman who diagnosed a complex mechanical system in approximately 30 seconds flat, who speaks multiple languages, who was reduced to nothing and didn't actually become nothing. He maintained her gaze. That's not broken. That's the inverse of broken. Valeth looked away first. Her throat moved through swallowing motions. The luminescence along her skin pulsed irregularly, and Marcus recognized this pattern as the moment when her emotional regulation systems fought against something stronger and lost humans. She whispered, and the word contained bewildered gratitude that translation would only diminish. 3 days later, Marcus made contact with a sheared conduit panel that made his assessment of pain management seem inadequate. The cut ran deep, bleeding with alarming enthusiasm, and he was applying pressure with a rag while his language became increasingly creative and profane when Valeth appeared and made an executive decision about the situation. You're sitting down, she ordered, not phrased as suggestion. It's fine, just tissue separation requires basic first aid. It requires suturing, and you possess the medical knowledge of a peculiarly stubborn mineral deposit. Sit down immediately. He sat. She retrieved the medical apparatus and went to work with precision that spoke of extensive training. Her hands were cool against his skin. Not cold exactly, but with the temperature profile of water from a shaded stream in warm weather. She cleaned the wound, applied topical pain management agents, and began the careful work of closure with micro-level suturing tools. "Your cellular structure is remarkable," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The clotting factor alone. Your blood achieves coagulation velocity nearly double that of Solarian physiology. Is that advantageous? It is efficient." She was studying his blood with the intensity of someone reading documented sacred material. "Your species possesses an extraordinary genetic adaptation capacity, mutation expressed as resilience rather than degradation. Among Solarian biology, such flexibility doesn't exist. Our genome is rigid, unchanging, and rigidity means we either achieve perfection or we fail. Middle ground does not exist in our biological framework." Something flickered behind her amber eyes, a concept forming, a question she wasn't yet prepared to voice audibly. "Your biology is more distinctive than you realize," she said, finishing the bandaging work. "More plastic, more capable." Neither of them moved to end the contact. His hand remained in her hands, temperature contrast stark between them. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome." She released his hand carefully, as though setting down something requiring delicate handling. Then she turned away, and Marcus caught the faintest intensification in her bioluminescent patterns before she disappeared into the corridor. That evening he taught her poker. She was objectively terrible at it initially. Her facial expressions were too transparent for a game where deception functioned as primary strategy. But by the fourth hand, she'd internalized the bluffing mechanics. By the seventh hand, she'd accumulated all his ration credits. "You're essentially a professional gambler," he said, throwing down his cards. "I'm a rapid learner," she corrected, and then she smiled, a genuine one, the first he'd witnessed. It transformed her entire facial structure, lighting something behind the amber irises that resembled captured starlight becoming conscious. The bioluminescent patterns along her cheekbones glowed like minor constellations. Marcus laughed. The sound surprised both of them. Her smile shifted, not disappearing, but becoming something more vulnerable. "When was the last time someone laughed in your presence?" he asked, immediately regretting the question, because the answer was already visible across her features. "An extremely extended duration ago," she said softly. "Valeth couldn't achieve sleep." The station hummed its perpetual mechanical lullaby, a background noise she'd acclimatized to across weeks, but her mind refused quietude. She occupied the converted storage area that had become her makeshift research facility, surrounded by salvaged medical equipment she'd recalibrated from the station's neglected medical bay. The genetic data on her display should not have achieved existence. She'd run the comparative analysis, 4 separate iterations. Human chromosomal markers positioned against Solarian reproductive compatibility indexes, the testing framework her own civilization utilized, the framework that had condemned her, measured exclusively one axis, Solarian female to Solarian male. Every cellular component of her being had been systematically mapped, assessed, and evaluated against her species' narrow parameters. She had failed, definitively, irreversibly, but those parameters were never universal. That fundamental truth suddenly seemed so obvious she couldn't believe she'd overlooked it. Where Solarian genetic architecture resembled crystalline structures, fixed, unchanging, locked into identical patterns across 100,000-year spans, human DNA moved. That was the only appropriate terminology. It danced, adapted, reached toward compatibility. The blood sample she'd retained from Marcus's wound showed cellular plasticity that her scientific intellect could barely process. His chromosomal markers didn't simply tolerate compatibility variants, they actively constructed bridges across previously impossible gaps. Her civilization's fertility testing measured a Solarian female's reproductive capacity specifically with Solarian males. Valeth had failed that assessment completely. But nobody had ever tested her against anything else, because her culture considered cross-species reproduction not merely impossible, but culturally abhorrent. The compatibility readout glowed green, not marginal, not borderline, fully compatible. The index was unprecedented in documented xenogenetic literature, because nobody had investigated, because her civilization had suppressed the investigation before it could initiate. She'd been scientifically close to asking these exact questions 7 years prior, when institutional authority had terminated her research access. Valeth closed the display and pressed her palms flat against the work surface. Her cardiac rhythm had elevated, not from scientific excitement, though that was definitely present, but from something more dangerous. Something that combined researcher and woman into a single trembling interrogative she wasn't yet brave enough to articulate. She began observing Marcus differently after that. The scientist in her cataloged everything. His movement efficiency, the breadth across his hands, The thermal radiation his biological structure produced, something no Solarian male generated. The way his eyes made contact with her, not with the evaluative coldness typical of Solarian males assessing worth, but with something steady and uncalculated that she possessed no framework for processing. The woman inside her, a component she'd never been permitted to fully acknowledge, noticed different elements, the jawline when his attention narrowed into focus, the manual competence when he worked machinery, the vocal register shift when physical exhaustion accumulated. Most significantly, the complete absence of any behavior suggesting she was a charity case, a broken component he generously tolerated. "You're engaging in prolonged visual observation again," he said one evening, catching her watching him repair communication equipment. "Your facial region contains grease distribution. That's basically my natural state at this point." Alternative justification. She looked away, fighting against a smile. The bioluminescent patterns along her arms, which she'd spent decades learning to suppress, flickered traitorously. Later that same day, they occupied the observation bay, their location, now the specific place where routine had become sanctuary. The gas giant's slow atmospheric spirals continued their patient rotation, and the stellar objects beyond continued their endless fusion reactions regardless of observation. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said. "Before we met, before everything fractured, what did you actually want? What would you have chosen if possibility wasn't constrained by systems and expectations?" Nobody had ever posed that question, not what she was supposed to want, not what institutions required, but what her autonomous consciousness actually desired. "I wanted to discover something meaningful," she said, "something that modified how people understood their own existence. And I wanted—" She hesitated. "I wanted family, not for political construction, not for genetic contribution to institutional bloodlines, but for warmth." The word expanded between them. "Your situation?" she asked. "What would you have selected?" Marcus was quiet momentarily. "I grew up in an orphanage following my genetic parents' death when I was extremely young. The institutional system didn't find permanent placement for me. When I reached 16, military service was essentially the remaining viable option." He scratched his neck. "I'd imagined having offspring eventually. Building the relational structure I never experienced. But years accumulate, postings to progressively remote locations. You stop planning future scenarios and just navigate present necessity." "You would function as an exceptional parental figure," Valith said, surprised by her own conviction. "How are you reaching that assessment?" "Because you position sustenance outside an unfamiliar female's quarters every single morning for 7 consecutive days, without once expecting her to open the barrier. That behavior demonstrates something fundamental about your character that relates directly to successful parental function." The silence afterward carried different qualities. Not tension exactly, but recognition. Two individuals positioned at an existential threshold. Valith moved first. She closed the physical distance between their seated positions and positioned her lips against his. The interaction was not urgent, not desperate. It was deliberate. A scientist testing a hypothesis. A woman exercising autonomous choice regarding her genuine desires for the first actual time in her existence. Marcus responded with deliberate slowness. His hand rose to her facial region, his thumb tracing the faint luminescent patterns along her cheekbone. He kissed her with deliberation, suggesting she was actually real, actually significant, actually going to remain. When they separated, her bioluminescent patterns blazed at maximum intensity. Every constellation across her dermis pulsed with amber luminescence matching her irises. "Your biological patterns," Marcus murmured. "They activate during intense emotional states." She whispered, "What are you experiencing?" She looked at him directly, and for the first time since arriving at this forgotten station, Valith Sorenkai responded to a direct inquiry, without calculating consequences first. "Existence," she said. "I experienced the sensation of genuinely existing." The weeks that followed constructed a reality, existing exclusively for two beings. They fell into relational patterns without ever formalizing the arrangement. Marcus maintained the station's mechanical systems. Valith transformed the storage room into an actual research facility. They shared nutritional events, exchanged biographical information, argued extensively about thermal preferences for sleeping quarters, a disagreement Valith eventually settled through data presentation. They occupied the same sleeping arrangement. They established morning routines together. She informed him his nickname derivation was undignified. She stopped correcting the nickname application on the 3rd day of continued usage. Valith registered physiological alterations gradually. The gastrointestinal upset she attributed to recycled atmospheric composition, the exhaustion she blamed on extended laboratory hours, the bioluminescent patterns intensifying to unprecedented luminescence levels she dismissed as atmospheric adaptation or emotional self-regulation. She was rationalizing, and her scientific cognition recognized this rationalization. While her emotional processing deliberately ignored the signal, she conducted the medical scan on what would typically be designated as Tuesday on any planetary location with consistent rotation. She positioned the medical sensor against her abdominal region and waited for readout completion. One heartbeat registered her own. A second emerged, small, rapid. The rhythm indicated developing cardiac function. A third heartbeat, matching the second's pattern but offset by fractional temporal intervals. Twins. Valeth stared at the data until numerical sequences blurred into visual abstraction. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the violent collision between every institutional statement about her nature and the undeniable biological reality pulsing inside her body. She was deficient, hollow, worthless, diminished. Those particular words had been embedded into her identity with such depth that she discontinued resistance. She'd accepted the judgment like gravity itself, simply the foundational structure of observable reality. Now the structure had fundamentally shifted. She found Marcus in the maintenance bay. He was welding structural components, visor lowered, spark cascade surrounding his workspace. She waited until the task achieved completion, until he retracted the visor and perceived her positioned in the entrance. His automatic smile initiated, then faltered as his cognitive processing registered something. "Something is wrong," he said, not phrased as question. "You appear to have experienced a traumatic vision," she replied. "Marcus, I need you to sit down." He sat. She crossed the space and placed both her hands over his. "I am experiencing a pregnancy state." He blinked, processing the statement. "Twins," she continued. "The scan confirms two distinct cardiac patterns. Marcus, I need you to understand what I'm communicating. This is medically impossible. My diagnostic evaluation was definitive and irreversible. Yet human genetic plasticity, your cellular markers specifically, they constructed compatibility bridges that Solarian biology couldn't establish. Silence measured itself across 3 heartbeats. She counted them. Then Marcus Cole, the forgotten individual on the forgotten station, the orphan child who'd never experienced family structure, generated something that restructured every assumption she'd constructed across her existence. He smiled. Not confusion, not shock, not the careful calculation of consequences. Joy, pure, fundamental, overpowering joy that flooded across his features like stellar radiation hitting planetary surface. His hands tightened around hers. His eyes brightened with moisture he made no attempt to suppress. "Twins?" he repeated, his voice fracturing across the syllable. "The analysis is confirmed. Dual heartbeats, genetically distinct, all developmental markers indicating healthy progression. Your biological structure adapted to my genetic framework and constructed impossible compatibility." She was explaining the scientific mechanism, but he wasn't listening to the technical components. He positioned her on his lap and enclosed her within his physical frame, pressing his face against her neck. His entire body generated tremors. "Marcus, please make an audible statement. I'm going to be a father," he said into her hair. "We're going to establish family structure." For the first time since childhood, when institutional authority informed her she was deficient, Valeth experienced complete emotional regulation collapse. She cried, actual moisture release, genuine emotional expression, and Marcus held her while the station's mechanical systems continued their tireless function, finally having achieved their actual purpose. Later, in the darkness of their quarters, he held his palm flat against her abdomen while she explained the xenogenetic mechanics, the compatibility mechanisms, the chromosomal bridging, the unprecedented nature of what their combined biology had accomplished through ordinary biological function rather than laboratory engineering. "Among my civilization," she explained, "twins register as sacred phenomena. Statistical occurrence suggests perhaps 1 instance per 100,000 births. Institutional authority will categorize this as impossible," he said. "Let them maintain whatever categorization satisfies them," Marcus replied, his thumb tracing slow circular patterns against her dermis. "I designate this as ours." She rotated to face him in the darkness. Her bioluminescent patterns activated at unprecedented illumination levels, sufficient to render his facial features visible, sufficient to illuminate their quarters without technological assistance. "I spent my entire existence receiving communication that I was fundamentally empty," she said. "Deficient. I accepted that judgment, even when resentment occupied my consciousness." Her hand positioned itself over his, which still rested across her abdomen. "Currently, I experience unprecedented fullness." They experienced 11 weeks of serenity. 11 weeks of morning routines and shared consumption of nourishment, and Marcus generating vocal communication directed toward her abdomen in tones Valeth pretended to find undignified but secretly recorded through data capture devices, 11 weeks of preparation and quiet fulfillment, and the progressive realization that they'd constructed something genuinely authentic in a location designed for forgetting. Then the Dominion inspection vessel emerged from faster-than-light transit without preliminary notification. Marcus was reviewing supply documentation when the proximity alarm activated throughout the station. He reached the command center in 4 rapid strides, experiencing a visceral sensation of gastrointestinal distress as his visual processing absorbed the threat indicator display. "Val," he transmitted, through the internal communication system, "arrive at the command center immediately." She appeared within minutes, her expression transforming from confusion to comprehension as she viewed the vessel's registry data. "That is a Dominion diplomatic-class warship," she said. "Why would they dispatch this classification for routine inspection procedures?" "It isn't routine," Marcus replied. The docking request arrived moments after this exchange. Marcus authorized it. Refusing would trigger automatic escalation protocols he wasn't prepared to navigate. The airlock opened, and Commander Rethus, the identical thin-lipped envoy who delivered Valeth with contempt and slurs, stepped through. He traversed the station's central corridor, accompanied by 2 armed guards, his gaze sweeping across the location with unconcealed contempt. Then his eyes registered Valeth. He stopped moving entirely. His facial expression cycled rapidly through confusion, recognition, then disbelief. His optical focus descended toward her abdominal region, where the bioluminescent patterns had intensified to maximum luminescence, the unmistakable visual declaration that a Solarian female carried developing offspring. "This is medically impossible," Rethus said, barely articulating the words. "And yet observation contradicts that statement." Valeth replied, ice present in every syllable. The commander's composure recalibrated into something colder, more dangerous. "You will transfer to Dominion Medical Evaluation Authority immediately. The pregnancy status will be terminated. All documentation will be classified at the highest level. You will be reassigned to observation facilities." "No," she said simply. "You're not negotiating authority here, child. Accurate. I'm initiating sovereign bloodline protection protocols. These developing organisms carry royal genetic lineage. Institutional authority cannot access them without constitutional violation." Her amber eyes burned with certainty. "You possess complete awareness of this regulatory framework. The charter was not composed to shield biological anomalies," Celine said slowly. Marcus stepped into the communication framework at this moment, positioning himself physically between the commander and Valeth with deliberate intentionality. "Those are my offspring you're describing as anomalies." Rethus examined him with the curiosity one might direct toward furniture that had somehow developed consciousness and opinions. "This does not involve you, human. Everything on this station involves me." Particularly her, Marcus's vocal register remained quiet, even the specific tonality that typically preceded destructive events. "Bred with her like animal specimens, and you imagine this grants you involvement rights in Dominion affairs?" the commander said. "I imagine protecting my family means exactly that," Marcus replied. His voice remained stable. "Test that boundary, and you'll comprehend what I'm communicating." Rethus's guards shifted, their hand positioning moving toward weapon apparatus. The atmospheric pressure in the corridor seemed to compress. Valeth moved forward, positioning herself beside rather than behind Marcus. "Commander Rethus," she vocalized, and her voice carried a resonance Marcus hadn't previously identified authority command presence. The vocal signature of royalty who'd abruptly remembered her lineage. "I'm invoking protected bloodline status. As a member of royal genetic lineage bearing recognized offspring. Institutional seizure is constitutionally prohibited. That statute is centuries outdated. It has not been formally repealed." Her words carried the precision of legal argument. "Seizure attempt will trigger high court proceedings before your vessel achieves system departure. How will Grand Matriarch Celine react when her direct heir generates constitutional crisis through her response?" Rethus stared at her. The mechanical calculation behind his ocular focus was nearly audible. He wanted to proceed. His entire physicality strained toward action. But the political calculation was mathematically unfavorable, and males like Rethus sustained existence through probability assessment rather than courage. "This situation will be documented," he said finally. "I possess no alternative expectation," Valeth replied. The commander pivoted and departed, his guards following without protest at the airlock junction. He paused without rotating his body. "You have modified nothing, Valeth. The Dominion will never sanction these biological aberrations." "The Dominion," she replied, "retains no authorization to define my offspring's nature." The airlock sealed. The cruiser detached. Marcus and Valeth maintained position in the corridor, observing through the viewport as the Solarian vessel accelerated into distance. "What remains in our temporal window?" Marcus asked. 7 cycles, perhaps 10 at maximum. "Rithus will submit direct report to Celine. She will not navigate through established legal channels. She will dispatch a military vessel. Then we require movement. Marcus was already heading toward the command console. I'm transmitting maximum priority distress signal on Earth Alliance military frequencies if anyone maintains any memory of my existence. You require awareness of something else, Valeth said, pursuing him with expression grave. This situation transcends personal circumstances. If the Dominion publicly acknowledges human Solarian reproduction capacity, it destabilizes the fundamental structure of their entire civilization. Marcus paused. You need to elaborate. The Dominion maintains control through fertility-based hierarchical stratification. Female individuals receive categorization based on reproductive capacity measurement. Those deemed infertile experience status removal, property confiscation, social erasure. They become the lowest classification, essential service providers, invisible. Her amber eyes burned with fierce certainty. Millions exist in this category, Marcus. Millions of Solarian females positioned as worthless because they cannot conceive with Solarian males. If those individuals comprehend that compatibility exists with other species, that their infertility assessment was never absolute, the entire hierarchical system collapses. The scope expanded in Marcus's comprehension like destructive wave propagation. This isn't exclusively about our offspring. Precisely. Our offspring function as evidence that the foundation of authority is constructed from falsified information. Marcus activated the distress signal. Then he commenced fortification procedures. 15 years of military function provided specific expertise regarding defensive architecture. A forgotten station could achieve defensibility through comprehension of angle strategy and restricted access points. He sealed secondary atmospheric barriers, redistributed electrical current to the docking bay's emergency containment mechanisms, and constructed improvised obstacles using maintenance inventory. Nothing that could repel organized assault, everything designed to decelerate advancement. Valeth worked alongside him, sharing biological knowledge from memory, vulnerable locations in Solarian armor systems, power distribution architectures where their protective plating exhibited structural weaknesses. She was mechanical and clinical. Every piece of tactical information delivered with the precision of someone whose academic background permitted easy conversion to offensive application. Your self-concept is misaligned with reality, Marcus told her as they worked through extended darkness. You understand that, correct? She looked at him. In the station's emergency illumination, her bioluminescent patterns blazed with unprecedented intensity. I experience increasing clarity regarding this misalignment, she replied. The Dominion warship emerged from faster-than-light transit after 6 additional solar cycles. Not diplomatic classification, Vanguard platform weapon systems. Bristling with technological superiority designed to reduce stations like Cathara to molecular dispersal. The station's structural integrity immediately experienced electromagnetic stress from the vessel's arrival. The communication request arrived instantaneously. Marcus accepted transmission. The female occupying the display screen was unmistakably royal lineage, older than Valeth, but structurally similar, except the elegance had been refined into weaponized form. Deep blue dermal coloration, silver hair maintained in military configuration, optical irises like frozen amber. Grand Matriarch Selene. Niece, she initiated. Aunt, Valeth replied, every syllable saturated with ice. You have created substantial inconvenience for institutional governance. I have merely rendered actual truth inconvenient. Those constitute distinct phenomena. Celine's facial expression remained fixed, but something shifted behind her optical focus. You will transfer yourself and the genetic material to Dominion Medical Authority. Pregnancy status will experience termination. Documentation will achieve maximum classification restriction. Reassignment to observation facilities will ensure continued monitoring of your medical condition. Negative. This situation does not permit negotiation. Offspring accurate. I am activating protected bloodline protocols. These organisms carry royal genetic architecture. Constitutional regulation prohibits seizure. You maintain complete comprehension of this regulatory structure. The charter was not composed to preserve biological perversions. Marcus stepped into visual range. Those are my offspring you're describing through derogatory terminology. Selene examined him with detached biological curiosity. The human, I anticipated something more impressive. Regrettably disappointing. Insufficient background information, apparently, Marcus replied. But human species excel at providing unexpected complications. Bravado, predictably unimpressive, Selene said. Her attention reverted to Valeth. You experience 1 hour to facilitate voluntary compliance. Beyond that temporal window, I will acquire what I came to obtain. The transmission terminated. Marcus was already engaged in tactical preparation. Solarian combat personnel count? 40 military specialists plus support crew, typically your strategic assessment? Worse circumstances than we currently confront? The statement was technically dishonest, but the falsity served practical function. 2 assault waves initiated. The initial deployment breached the docking bay barrier, penetrating the emergency containment mechanisms with military-grade thermal cutting apparatus. Marcus positioned himself in the corridor junction he'd prepared, utilizing the station's constrained passages to counteract their numerical superiority. Illumination flashed in blue-white strobing patterns. Solarian combatants were rapid and disciplined, but their tactical formation assumed open environmental engagement. Confined station geometry reversed their advantage. He eliminated 3 military personnel during the initial confrontation, sustained a thermal weapon graze across his shoulder that generated significant pain, but continued backward repositioning. He retreated into the secondary location Valeth had prepared, drawing them deeper into the station's maintenance channel labyrinth. Secondary deployment penetrating through airlock 4, Valeth transmitted via communication system. Her vocal tone remained stable. Guiding him through the station architecture like combat operations represented her actual expertise. "Can you generate barrier?" he asked. "Already terminating barrier function. Atmospheric pressure redistribution, creating vacuum isolation. Manual penetration requires 4 additional minutes. 4 minutes represented survival margin or fatal miscalculation, depending on tactical execution. The subsequent combat compressed into brutal sequence. Marcus deployed every tactical principle his service record encompassed, plus several the official manual would have formally prohibited. But numerical pressure continued escalating, more military personnel, tireless advancement through casualty accumulation, with institutional determination that never contemplated refusal as possibility. An inner corridor barrier fractured. 3 combatants penetrated the secondary fortification. Marcus engaged 2 with controlled energy discharges. Eliminating them, the third advanced past his position. A thermal weapon activated from the corridor junction. Then silence. Marcus navigated toward the engagement location and discovered Valeth positioned above the incapacitated soldier, a weapons apparatus in her manual grasp, her facial expression carved from stone. "He remains alive?" Marcus asked. Armor plating exhibited compromise in the joint region. "He will regain consciousness in approximately 60 minutes, she confirmed. She possessed no training in weapons operation. She'd never been trained for combat scenarios. Her face was wounded where structural debris had impacted, her forearm generating fluid discharge. She was pregnant and magnificent and braver than any military personnel Marcus had ever encountered. "You're genuinely exceptional," he said. "Survival generates motivation," she replied, transferring the weapon apparatus to his possession. "Additional information remains," she added. "Your transmitted communication signal was received." The station shuddered violently, not from weaponry. Something larger was exerting gravitational stress. Through the closest viewport, 2 Earth Alliance frigate vessels materialized from faster-than-light transit, their geometric hull structures reflecting the gas giant's illumination. The identification beacon transmitted, EAS Resolute, commanded by Captain Alara Voss, his previous commanding authority, the officer who'd fought to maintain his service status when institutional command recommended discharge, who'd pushed for his reassignment to Cathara, which he'd resented at the time, but now comprehended as strategic positioning. She'd positioned him somewhere isolated, waiting for the moment when the external universe would require him again. The Resolute initiated hailing procedures to the Dominion warship. The exchange remained brief. 2 Alliance frigates possessed superior weaponry compared to individual Vanguard platform. Selene, despite her fury, comprehended mathematical certainty. The Solarian vessel withdrew. Boarding personnel retreated toward their departure transport. As the enemy vessels increased distance, Selene's final transmission activated across the station communication apparatus. "This situation achieves no ultimate modification. Valeth. The Dominion will never formally recognize those offspring." Valeth remained in the damaged corridor, one hand positioned protectively across her abdomen. She observed the warship diminishing against the starfield. "She is incorrect," she said quietly. "This situation achieves fundamental change." Aboard the Resolute, the medical division engaged with Valeth using the enthusiastic intensity of specialists encountering documented unprecedented events. Analytical apparatus hummed with activity. Data accumulated with systematic progression. 2 distinct heartbeats registered on equipment substantially more sophisticated than the station's salvaged medical infrastructure. "Human-Solarian biological hybrids," the chief medical officer murmured, reviewing genetic architecture. "Initial documented instance across galactic documentation. The chromosomal connection mechanisms exclusively will require revision of multiple academic reference materials." The information will not experience classification restriction, Voleth stated from the examination platform. Her vocal authority permitted no alternative interpretation. It will achieve public distribution with complete methodological transparency. The medical specialist glanced toward Captain Voss, who occupied the medical chamber's entrance with her arms crossed, and the facial expression of an individual who'd abandoned any expectation of surprise regarding Marcus Cole's existence trajectory years prior. "You heard the authorization?" Voss said. Marcus located Valeth in the vessel's mess facility. She was consuming nourishment with concentrated focus, apparently operating under the assumption that meal consumption required absolute attention. He positioned himself across from her and captured her manual grasp. "What emerges as our subsequent trajectory?" he posed. She observed him. "I cannot navigate toward the Dominion. I lack established assignment destination. Cathara Station currently demonstrates structural damage of considerable magnitude. We exist without physical location, not without actual destination." His hand pressure increased marginally. "Our destination is wherever you are, wherever they will be." Her optical irises softened. The luminescent patterns along her dermis still burned at intensified levels, brighter than she'd ever naturally produced. They pulsed in rhythm that synchronized with his cardiac function. "Humans," she whispered. "You compress complete universes into the most elementary statements. 3 orbital rotations following the defensive engagement. The Earth Alliance Diplomatic Assembly convened on Arcturus Station. The Solarian Dominion was formally confronted with Valeth's genetic documentation. Her reconstructed research, corroborated by Earth Alliance biological specialists, irrefutably demonstrated that Solarian infertility categorizations were species-specific classification systems. Millions of individuals categorized as deficient possessed actual biological capacity for reproduction through cross-species genetic interaction. The political consequence transmitted like seismic activity through the Dominion's power structure. Within weeks, covert communication networks composed of individuals classified as infertile initiated organizational activity. Encrypted message systems transmitted through protected channels. The linguistic designation hollow, which had functioned as shame branding for generations, experienced reclamation and repurposing as revolutionary insignia. Valeth, regardless of whether she'd intended this outcome, had become something larger than individual person. She'd become symbolic representation. She'd become proof. She experienced delivery complications on what the Arcturus facility designated as Tuesday twin offspring. The first arrived through biological process and demonstrated human respiratory capacity by generating volume output that caused the medical team significant surprise. The second appeared approximately 90 seconds following the initial delivery. Queter, her diminutive biological structure already gripping the attending physician's finger with power that generated spontaneous laughter. Marcus held both organisms, one positioned within each upper appendage, blue-violet dermis with thermal radiation underneath. Amber ocular focus flecked with his gray irises, capturing ambient illumination. Bioluminescent patterns already becoming apparent along their small forearms, faint as stellar radiation through cloud density but unmistakably present. They were medically impossible. They were physiologically actual. They were his. His vocal apparatus became temporarily non-functional. Full-duration minutes passed before language restoration occurred. Valeth observed his facial expression from her medical positioning, physiologically exhausted but radiating something approximating transcendence. "Generate spoken communication," she requested. "Facial mobility has experienced excessive activation," he managed. "I believe my facial muscles have achieved permanent modification." She generated acoustic vibration that constituted laughter, tired, fractured, radiating genuine emotional fulfillment. What genetic designations do we allocate to them? They'd established this decision weeks prior through collaborative dialogue. One genetic nomenclature from Solarian tradition, one from Earth origin, determined collaboratively. "Solari," he said, observing the initial offspring. "The Solarian terminology for solar emergence." "And Lily," Valeth said, manipulating the second offspring's facial area. An Earth botanical specimen she'd absorbed through Marcus's extensive descriptions of terrestrial rain events. And G.